So welcome everyone. My name is Susan Schoenberger. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Communications at Hartford Seminary. We have been doing a series of webinars this spring to address issues that we felt were very topical and that issues where we could help in a particular way. And we are thrilled to have Mike Corey here today to talk to us about the disaster response in Connecticut. And we'd like to be able to open up the conversation after a presentation so that people can address any issues that they're particularly concerned about or worried about. I'll just ask that if you stay on mute during the presentation, that would be helpful in case we have any barking dogs or doorbells ringing or anything like that. And then we'll find a way, we'll find the best way, depending on how many people we have on the call, to have questions discussed. But if you do have questions and you're not sure you're going to remember your question, go ahead and put that in the chat and I will moderate that, come back to it. That's really all from my end, and I just want to welcome Mike and thank him for taking time away from what has been probably an incredibly hectic few months, made even more hectic in the last week or so. And everyone here, I'm sure, is here to really get some sense of what you're dealing with and also some wisdom around how you stay calm. You look pretty calm. How you deal with all of this on your own as well. So thank you, Mike. Welcome.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation for today, and hopefully everybody can see that. So again, good afternoon, and thank you for the gift of your time today, and thank you for logging in to hear this presentation. I hope, as I said to someone earlier, I hope to be informative. If not, I'll try to be entertaining, or maybe a little bit of both. I will apologize ahead of time. I've got two dogs. They will start barking at some point because they are very determined that while I'm doing this, not to let a squirrel or a passing jogger or bicyclist sneak up on me without some warning. So you may hear them sounding an alarm, but it should be okay. So by way of introduction, there's actually several hats that I wear in kind of the response area and in community involvement. And some of this will take some explanation that I'll get to during our presentation. So my day job is I'm actually Director of Meals on Wheels for Western Connecticut. So I'm primarily professionally involved with feeding and food insecurity issues in the greater Waterbury and Danbury areas. I'm also the chair of Connecticut Villette, which is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. This is the network of nonprofits that are all volunteer-based that have an active role when a crisis hits. You normally would think of like hurricane response or a flood or a tornado, but now we're also looking at pandemic. And these are organizations like Red Cross and Salvation Army and so on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because to understand the volunteer framework for response is really important to understand that VOAD network. Also in that VOAD world, I'm the chair of the Volunteer Management Committee for National VOAD, and that's right now there's some interesting things because this pandemic environment is changing the way we think about volunteerism in response. And for the organizations that the heavy lifting and the work requires volunteers, we're now looking at this to see how this is going to change all of that. And then finally, I'm also the Diocesan Disaster Coordinator for the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. So I work with Episcopal Relief and Development in that area. So that's just one more hat. And this is really common in the disaster response world. If you're involved in one thing, you tend to be involved in half a dozen different things. And you get to wear all sorts of hats, and you try to figure out which one you need to put on at any given time. So just a really quick overview on what we're going to talk about, because I really do want to leave plenty of room for questions. I want to start with getting some concepts out of the way because the disaster response world is very jargon rich and very acronym rich. In fact, I always joke that there is a book to get you through all the acronyms. It's called the Federal Acronyms and Terms FEMA produces. So it actually has its own acronym called the FAT book, which is quite ironic. But I want to get some of these concepts out of the way just so we can kind of understand what they are if and when they come up. So we're going to start at that like 30,000 foot view. What does the environment look like for disaster response? Then we're going to kind of narrow it down into Connecticut and what does the volunteer response look like in Connecticut? And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about what you can do, either as a volunteer or how to help in a way that makes a difference. And so I want to talk about first these four phases, or these four big concepts. First is the whole community concept. This is a term that is used by emergency managers quite a bit. It's kind of the philosophy of emergency management currently. This goes back to 2009, so it really kind of comes right after Hurricane Ike, just before, say, the Haiti earthquake and Sandy. Whole community concept is a philosophy that was first introduced by Craig Fugate, former director of FEMA, who takes the approach that the response to disaster is not necessarily the responsibility of, say, the government or public safety or Red Cross. It takes the whole community to respond to disaster. And that has to be done in a collaborative way so that the needs of the community can be met. So this is kind of the concept that we're currently in the response community, is this whole community concept that everybody from federal level agencies all the way down to the individual has a role to play during the response. The second term you'll hear me use quite a bit is VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. I'm going to give a quick thumbnail sketch of what that's all about. But you can look at it in two ways. There's national VOAD, which is that national network of organizations, and then there are state and territorial VOAD. So Connecticut has its own. Likewise, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and so on. Emergency support functions. This is a kind of a key concept in how we divide up the things to do during response. There's about 20 different emergency support functions, and these are kind of organized into key areas. So mass care being one of them. That's a really important one right now because that's feeding and housing and things like that, medical care. There is communications, there's safety, public safety, individual assistance. So when funds need to be requested, say from the federal government, to provide individual assistance grants to help people rebuild, that's where it is. But so the workload is kind of divided up into these ESFs, these emergency support functions. And then finally is to understand disasters, to understand there's four phases of a disaster. There's the preparedness phase. This is what we do to get ready. So for an individual, this is having an emergency kit in your home with a flashlight and maybe a few days worth of shelf-stable meals and things like that. That's the preparedness component of disaster. Then there is mitigation, and that is the steps that you can do to lessen the impact. So I'll use a place of worship as an example, is having an emergency plan is one way to help mitigate the impact of disaster, because that way you know what everybody's role is and what's going to happen should an emergency or disaster arise. Then there's the response phase, pretty self-explanatory. This is the initial response to disaster. So this typically involves things like emergency management, public safety, and those roles. This is that's stabilizing the situation would be kind of one way to look at it. And then there's recovery, and there's two phases within recovery, short-term and long-term. So short-term recovery is the process of reestablishing infrastructure, getting the power back on, getting lines of communication open again. That's that very immediate after the response, those first few weeks typically. And then there's long-term recovery, and that is the rebuilding phase, rebuilding homes, rebuilding businesses, economic support for communities. And this can go on for years and years and years. For example, the 2012 Hurricane Sandy, the recovery process for Sandy in some areas is still ongoing. So that recovery period can go on for quite some time. Likewise for Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, estimates are 8 to 10 years. That actually may go longer because of some other events. So then the other thing to understand about disasters, and this one is, this is the slide I'd kind of like to throw out the window right now, because this is not as accurate as we thought it once was. And this is the disaster continuum. What happens to us as we go through disaster? There's this pre-disaster period. So a hurricane, in fact, on the screen just to my left, I've got the National Hurricane Center map up showing the storm in the Gulf. This is that warning and threat period. We can see something's coming, we know we have to act. And then there's the impact phase, and that's where, you know, spiritually, emotionally, our mental health can be really negatively impacted in that initial, the initial impact of the storm or the event. And then there's that, in the response phase, we start going into that heroic phase where we really see the community coming together. We see first responders, those great stories of people being plucked off roofs and things like that. There's this heroic and this honeymoon phase, and then it quickly crashes into this disillusionment. And that's where we kind of go through that grief process as we come out of that. But there are these triggering events that will kind of set us back a little bit. An anniversary could be just a sensory reminder that something isn't right. And then the reconstruction, that long-term recovery period that we're in. And I actually kind of go with a new theory is this: if you look back at the pre-disaster, that is what we thought was normal. And typically we say we're working to a new normal. The way I've kind of approached it is we're working towards the next normal, because that normal will get shaken up too at some point down the road. Now, the reason I say we can kind of throw this out the window, I mean, on a very basic level, this works. This is typically seen following a hurricane or something like that. However, what we're seeing now, and this is not new, so that's why I said this is a very basic stripped down version of what this really looks like, is we're seeing layered disaster. We're in a pandemic. We have civil unrest. We have racial tension in our country, in our communities. We have one problem stacked on another. And as of today, we're looking at possibly the third named tropical storm of the 2020 hurricane season, which is only 1 day old at this point. And we know that there will be hurricanes during this season, and they could impact the United States. They could also impact New England. So we can layer on disasters, which really complicates this kind of this chart, this continuum. And this isn't new. In 2010, the Haiti earthquake was complicated in a recovery process by a cholera outbreak, which is still going on today. The Fukushima event started with an earthquake, tsunami results, and a radiological disaster. Hurricane Maria, really that was two hurricanes. Irma hit Puerto Rico, and then Maria hit Puerto Rico. There was, and this is something that most don't know because it's a very technical thing, but there was an event on the sun that actually disrupted communications as we were trying to reestablish them in Puerto Rico. That gets complicated in a recovery period by a series of earthquakes and a pandemic that has slowed the recovery period down. And even locally, the 2013 Boston Marathon started out as a large event staffed by hundreds of volunteers, interrupted by a terrorist incident. So this layering of disasters is common. It happens, and that complicates this kind of continuum. So that's kind of the framework I really wanted to kind of get to understand some of the concepts, and also there is a little bit of sense that could be made out of this. And I tend to subscribe to the idea that order is a human-made concept. Chaos is the natural state. When we try to make order out of chaos, it very rarely goes our way. The best we can do is try to find harmony in it and try to find some path through the chaos. And unfortunately, that's the way disaster tends to be, is we have to try to find that path through chaos, and it gets more complicated, especially as we're facing two events right now that are probably first for many of us in our lifetime to deal with: a pandemic and the widespread unrest that is going on across the country right now. So with that, I want to move into the volunteer world and what the volunteers really do to help communities through these times. And right now, they're actively involved with pandemic response, plus A lot of responses that we're not seeing. There were a series of tornadoes in Tennessee and Texas. Volunteers are out assisting there. Volunteers are still in Puerto Rico assisting with Maria recovery. And I just got the email this morning. National Villette is looking at how the volunteer organizations, their membership can respond to current crisis going on. So, National VOAD was somebody is unmuted. Can you please make sure your line is muted, please? Thank you. National VOAD was founded in 1970, so 50 years ago. And I'll get into a little bit more about their history. But what National VOAD does is it provides a forum which fosters more effective delivery of services to the communities impacted by disasters. It was noticed very early on. The 6 organizations that founded National VOAD in 1970 realized that following Hurricane Camille, they were duplicating efforts, and also some needs were not being met. So it was much better for the organizations, the volunteer-based organizations that are working to respond to in the communities, to operate under what they call the 4 C's philosophy: cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration. And through this approach, they brought others under this umbrella. And today there's about 75 national organizations that are part of this, as well as the state and territorial VOADs. So a little bit of the history of it. Following Hurricane Camille, 1969, 6 organizations came together. I usually can rattle them off pretty quick, but I know Red Cross, Salvation Army, Brethren Disaster Services, Catholic Charities, St. Vincent de Paul, and one other, I can't think of it off the top of my head, were involved in forming this coalition. It strengthened over time. It became a national movement. Other organizations joined in. In the 80s and 90s, the national VOAD started being developed at a local and regional level into state VOAD coalitions. That eventually became more formalized. The state VOADs really took off following right around 2000. And in 2009, the partnership concept began. So a national VOAD collectively could partner with places like FEMA, the Coast Guard, National Guard Bureau, things like that, where they could partner with the federal responders as well and take that 4 C's philosophy and also work with government organizations, but not just government organizations, but corporations too. UPS has a very active disaster response component corporately. Target does as well. So they become partners in this movement as well. And 2011, this vision for expanding the role of National VOAD kind of got a bit of a shot in the arm, and now nationally they are an integrated part of our national response, and in many states an integrated part of the state response to disaster. So again, there's 65 national organizations. This is actually a few years old. It's closer to 75 now. And what is interesting is out of those organizations, about 2/3 are faith-based. Just about every faith tradition has something in their belief that assisting and responding during disaster is a critical part of faith. And so at the national level, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism are all well represented as national organizations that are part of this movement. There's also a lot of community-based organizations, professional organizations. So there's one organization of people that work professionally in logistics, and referral services. Those are a couple areas that are part of this national movement. And other non-governmental organizations are included as well. Each one kind of comes in with a different specialty, if you will. Red Cross is well known for sheltering. Southern Baptists are great at providing both food and hygiene capability following a disaster. So all of these have their own specialties that they bring to the table. And then each state and U.S. territory also has a VOAD that is represented to this national body as well. And again, various partner agencies with that. So the work of the VOAD, so it's not just about coming together, waiting for something to happen and then applying that 4 C's. Throughout throughout the year, really, the National VOED members are involved with a lot of committee work that produces very specific things. So this committee work, the whole list is right here. Of course, I'm gonna pick on volunteer management since that's my committee. That committee meets monthly throughout the year, as the others do as well. What we look at doing is producing training webinars, conference presentations, points of consensus, which is a VOED way of saying best practices. If you're going to do volunteer management, here are the things we've identified as the best practices in volunteer management. And we do this for the benefit of each member organization, but also for the volunteers that are out there doing the work. So what does volunteers do? And this is one of the great things about having a national organization like this that can gather this information. So in 2016, with only half of the members reporting in, over 5 million individual volunteers contributing over 48 million hours of response effort and also in the other phases as well, and over $1.2 trillion of volunteer value. So there is actually a calculation nationally that is used to determine what a volunteer's time is worth. And when we have to advocate on behalf of volunteers, this is unfortunately what really does speak is the numbers like this. What I've found in my own experience is that it's the stories the volunteers tell of assisting their communities that really is the loudest and most impressive voice. So in Connecticut, we have Connecticut VOED. And this is just a really quick rundown of who we define ourselves to be in our mission statement. We don't quite have the 75 members that National VOED has, but we have a lot of organizations across the state that have joined us so that we can pool that expertise together, pool that volunteer resource together, and effectively respond during times of crisis. These are just some of our members, and I really want to indicate or talk a little bit briefly about what some of them are actively doing, because it really does say a lot about what the volunteer role is in the COVID environment. So of course, one of the big ones is Red Cross. They're always the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to disaster response, but they're a tremendous resource to have. They actually have a virtual family assistance center. So one of the things that Red Cross typically will do is provide services to families affected by disaster, but you can't do that in person right now. So they're actually doing it online and matching families to resources. Of course, if you've seen the news, you know Connecticut Food Bank and Food Share have been really active in doing food distribution across the state. Team Rubicon, some may not be too familiar with that. That is a nonprofit made up of former military members who used the skills they learned in the military to do disaster response and other work in the community. They're actually doing a lot of data work behind the scenes, a lot of virtual work just to support volunteer recruitment and referral out to other organizations. Of course, United Way 211 is kind of that central referral source in the state. And Salvation Army is actively involved with feeding and also running homeless shelters across the state, which are now, in many cases, being relocated to hotels. And of course, Meals on Wheels is continuing to provide homebound meal service to seniors. So what are we seeing? What are the critical areas? So when this first started back in March, what was quickly identified as those critical areas that we needed to zero in on was feeding. The food insecurity issue continues to be a tremendous need across the state, as food pantries have issues both with inventory, but more often than not with volunteers capable of providing the services. Homeless shelters, obviously anything that's a shelter has the problem of social distancing is not exactly possible in that kind of environment. So finding new places to do sheltering. Medical needs, of course, you know, the medical system is incredibly taxed because of the response, and identifying folks that can assist and provide, you know, either come out of retirement or take training that they've received elsewhere and bring it into service in the healthcare field. And of course, undocumented citizens as well, who are there's a whole unique set of challenges in trying to provide them with critical services, and also building those relationships and connections within the community to so that they can get through this and have the resources that they need. And I know several organizations have been involved with that. So some emerging areas. This is one thing that we're starting to see now. Well, this has really been going on for about a month now. Is that as this response to the pandemic continues, and this is going to also change with other events going on. There's been these other impacts that we're anticipating. Elections are coming up, both general and the primary and general elections. Those are events that are typically heavily dependent upon volunteers, and typically the volunteers that assist those are in at-risk groups. So they are anticipating that volunteers may not be able to come out as they normally would. Animals. Rescue organizations. Now, it's an interesting thing. What we're seeing is small animal rescue organizations like Dog Star Rescue, for example, are seeing an increase in the number of adoptions. Humane societies and animal shelters, same thing. But it's the large animal rescue organizations that are or identifying some new needs, as more people can't quite take care of a horse or goats as they once were, and they have to find some place where they can be taken care of. So that's kind of an emerging need. Volunteer management. As volunteers disappear from a lot of organizations, new volunteers are emerging. So the one thing about most, what I would call blue sky day volunteers, is a large percentage are in at-risk populations, 60 or older, particularly. And they're, of course, following the advice, stay home, stay safe. However, what we're seeing is students who can't go back to school, folks who have been furloughed or laid off, are now saying, I've got all this extra time on my hands. I want to volunteer. So this turnover in volunteers is happening, and that also creates a volunteer management problem. There's a lot of small organizations that don't think about volunteer management in their day-to-day operations, because they've got this small group that's always been there, and they do their thing, and they've always been doing that thing. And now you've got new people coming on board that you really have to figure out how to take on and how to train. And one of the big areas, burnout, stress, and compassion fatigue. This is just, honestly, it's going to get worse as time goes on. Even amongst, Brett and I were talking about this not too long ago. If you work in disaster response, you're used to your response period being a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks. You get a day off here and there. There's no break from this. And everywhere you go, you're faced with it. You cannot avoid it. And this becomes a reality, both for not only for people professionally in disaster response, but also the volunteers and just people in general, as we're all facing this. And recently I had a conversation with an Episcopal priest in Minneapolis who's serving on the front lines of the protests there. And we were talking about this, and he referred to an expert on the subject of compassion fatigue, who observed that that the normal antidote for compassion fatigue is rest. Just stop doing for a little bit and re-energize. But that's not possible now. The new recommendation that they're offering is praise. As you're working with folks, make sure to compliment, to lift up, to say good job. And if you're in a management position where you typically have to be very analytical, you have to look at what's working and what's not working. Don't focus as much on what's not working. Just take the time to zero in on what is going right, because that little shot in the arm of some praise can actually help counter some of this compassion fatigue, burnout, stress. So the challenges that we're facing is definitely replacing volunteers. As volunteers are disappearing in some organizations, they've got to be replaced. And how do you recruit when you also have to be socially distant from one another? And also, how do you be a volunteer in this environment, especially in an area that requires one-on-one contact with people? I mentioned, we're a day into hurricane season, and one of the response needs that you typically run into with a hurricane is evacuating to shelters, which is staffed by volunteers. So how do you shelter people and volunteer in a place that is just entirely counter to any kind of social distancing? So being the volunteer and serving disaster survivors are both challenges that we have to face, and there is no single solution to this that anybody has found. I think that collectively at the national level, all these organizations are trying to get their head around how do we do disaster response, especially if we get hit by a big hurricane. So here are some learnings so far that we found. Centralized volunteering, one-stop shopping to become a volunteer to assist, is incredibly valuable. Some states have this. In Florida, they have a program called Volunteer Florida. There's Volunteer New Hampshire. California serves. Some states have, and typically it's because of a disaster. These are things you learn by falling on your face, sort of thing. You don't learn these things on blue sky days. They've set up these mechanisms so that there is that one-stop shopping that can then match the volunteer to the right role with the right organization. So that is something that unfortunately Connecticut doesn't have, at least in any kind of formal structure, and we're working on that. How do you serve at-risk, marginalized, and underserved populations? This is really bringing this to light, and it is something that has really been an issue with every disaster, but more and more so the disaster response community is saying we really need to be focusing on this, because typically this is where government is not looking, at least not from an emergency management and public safety perspective. Our understanding of pandemic as disaster, there's two issues here. First off is we think of it as a public health crisis, and depending on where you're coming from, if you come from the public health area, it stays as a public health crisis. If you're coming from the emergency management or disaster side, this is a disaster. It really is a little bit of both. So it's understanding it as public health crisis, understanding it as disaster, and there will be a recovery period from this. We're still in response right now, and maybe for quite some time to come, but there is also going to be a recovery phase from this, and it will hopefully prompt us to think about preparedness and mitigation efforts, because pandemics do happen. It will likely happen again. So it's understanding it as disaster. And I've been reminded so many times. So I've been involved with this for about 20 years. And when I was first going through some emergency management training, they used pandemic as one of those scenarios you had to exercise with. And the first thing they told you is, we don't know if any of this works because we haven't had a pandemic since 1918. We're still in that role. So it's also knowing that we don't have a great playbook to go by on how to address this. We've had some lessons learned from SARS and swine flu and other epidemics, but on this scale, this is something fairly new. And another thing that we're learning is the need for virtual volunteerism, and we're seeing that emerge, and I think nationally trying to get a sense of what that really looks like and how can we make that part of that volunteer landscape moving forward. So some of the activities that are ongoing to address those critical needs, the challenges we're facing in the emerging situations. So we are doing volunteer intake. This is one thing that it has prompted the state to set up. There's actually two systems, and I'll provide all these links on the final slide. There is Connecticut Responds. You may have actually seen some TV commercials about that. That is for the medical community. That's for medical responders. And then for everything else, there is what they call the DART platform, which is Disaster Agency Response Technology. It's not an acronym I came up with. It's something from the vendor. But this is, it's a website. You can go to it, dart-ct.communityos.org. where you can sign up as a volunteer. You're put into a pool. You go through create a profile. You have to go through a background check. That's a state requirement for volunteers, is you have to be background checked. And then you're put into a pool that can match you up with specific opportunities across the state. So to date, we've had this system up and running for about 8 weeks now. There are about 2,000 volunteers that have stepped forward. There are about 400 opportunities. So definitely more volunteers than jobs to do, which is a nice problem to have when you're managing volunteers. But we also have to keep in mind that this response is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So we will be needing volunteers for quite some time to come. So what are these opportunities? A lot of them revolve around three key areas. Feeding, particularly homebound meal delivery and food pantries. And then the third area is homeless shelters. However, that's expanding to take on some new things. In recent days, we've also matched volunteers, assist with blood drives run by the Red Cross, and to support elections and providing those volunteers to the Secretary of State's office. So feeding, of course, that's on the news almost daily. The picture here shows Rentschler Field at one of the food share drives. Feeding really involves three key areas: is homebound meal delivery, food pantry supply, and food distribution. Both large scale like this and smaller scale. Comes to mind is Camp Washington up in Morris, where which is the summer camp for the Episcopal Church, that's doing some food distribution in that community. So it could be very small scale like that, or very large scale like Rentschler Field here. Red Cross has set up the Virtual Family Assistance Center, so providing the condolence care for families affected by COVID. Emotional and spiritual care which that shouldn't be in all caps, but emotional and spiritual care is another key component, as well as mental health. As I said, as this goes on, the effect on the emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being of people and responders, it's taking its toll. And organizations like Disaster Chaplains Association, Southern Baptists have set up hotlines for emotional and spiritual care, as well as Salvation Army and other faith-based organizations. There's also some counseling services that are being established to help with the mental health component in this as well. And one of the biggest things that we've seen and working on addressing as a collaborative effort amongst the VOAD members is these unmet needs, and these are the ones that fall through the cracks. These are the ones that pop up out of the blue. A good example is a phone call I got about a month ago from United Way, where someone needed groceries and they could not get them through any of the kind of the normal channels. It was an emergency situation. And so I ended up calling a friend who is in the ordination process in the Episcopal Church with me, and said, hey, could you stop by the food pantry and pick up a bag of groceries and take it to so-and-so? And she says, yep, no problem. And we were able to take that care of. These kind of things, these pop-up needs that aren't being met through kind of that organizational process structure, are becoming far more frequent. And I know Salvation Army, Food Share, and United Way are currently working on a system to try to build another safety net so these needs are taken care of. So what can you do? First off, I want to say I always have to say every disaster talk about donations. If you donate, two things. First of all, donate to a reputable organization. There are many ways to check if an organization is good, especially if they're a member of National VOAD or Connecticut VOAD. There is a certain amount of vetting that goes into our membership. And the second is financial donations do far more good than in-kind donations. Money can be turned into whatever you need it. Oftentimes items donated may not actually meet the needs at hand. And the story I always tell is after a hurricane, it was either a shoe company or a chain of department stores donated a tractor trailer load of shoes to a community. And they brought it out and everybody came out for shoes. And then they realized that this 53-foot semi full of shoes contained nothing but shoes for the left foot only. So they were of absolutely no use to anybody unless you only had a left foot. And in that case, you had shoes for a lifetime. But it was not helpful. And Hurricane Irma hit Key West, and there were donations of winter coats, because winter coats are definitely a needed item in Key West. Donate money, don't donate goods. It is just far more helpful to the organizations. There's far less logistics that have to go into turning that donation into something helpful. Volunteering. So here are some things to know about volunteering in the COVID environment. First off, there are plenty of virtual opportunities out there. If you can contact an organization directly, you can ask about that. A lot of them are just kind of checking on the well-being. There's also a lot of data entry stuff going on right now that requires assistance, and phone banks and things like that. If you're in an at-risk group, the advice for a lot of the organizations, there isn't just kind of a one-size-fits-all advice on this, but I know Team Rubicon and others, this is not the time, if you are in an at-risk group, this is not the time to do in-person volunteer until the crisis passes. If you're at risk, please continue to follow the guidance or look for virtual opportunities as well. Second is you can go, or third, I'm sorry, go to the dart-ct communityos.org. If you would like to sign up as a volunteer, you can do so there. There is a small cost for the background check. If you don't want to pay that, the state will pay it for you. So there is, you can register there as a volunteer at no cost. If you're a medical volunteer, please go to CT Response. The medical needs are going to continue to grow, especially as things like contact tracing become a key area. Mentioned earlier, it's a marathon, not a sprint. If you do sign up with any one of these organizations, do not be surprised if you don't get a call back right away. There, as I mentioned with the system that I'm running, this DART system, there's 2,000 volunteers, there's 400 opportunities. So be sure to be patient and realize that a lot of these are also these systems are being managed by volunteers who are doing this kind of in the evenings and matching these folks up with other organizations. If you're going to take local action, be effective, look for what the needs are. You can ask worship communities and local emergency management, local governments, local social services are a good place to start if you need to find out what the immediate needs are in your area. Be networked. This is not the time to work within a silo. I've been doing a lot of work with feeding ministries in the northwest part of the state, and it's interesting to see some of the networks that are starting to build out, that people are now realizing that it's not just my place of worship, it's not just my food pantry, it is this much larger and broader network that is that's active. So when you get engaged in this broader network, it also helps to identify more needs and also more resources. And again, stay safe. If you do volunteer and you're doing in-person volunteering with any organization, by all means, ask to make sure that they've got COVID guidance for their volunteers. We've developed it for Meals on Wheels and some other organizations. Team Rubicon has done a good job with this, as well as some of the faith-based groups, but make sure that that they provide you with that guidance on how to be a safe volunteer in this environment. If you represent an organization, I know that I think some of you probably have taken a nonprofit class, so maybe you've formed a nonprofit based on what you've learned from there, and you want to be part of this network. By all means, join the VOAD movement. Just because you're normally not active in disaster response, what we're learning from this is we all have a part to play. So we really want all those organizations to have a voice at that VOAD table and get plugged into that broader network of resources and volunteers and be able to collaborate on the things that help keep our community safe. So get networked, join VOAD, there's also the Connecticut Nonprofit Alliance, another great resource, but definitely make sure you're getting plugged into the broader network. And I think that opens us up for questions.
Mike, maybe you want to, if you want to stop sharing your screen, then we can all, I can.
There we go.
Great. I think we've got everybody here on the screen. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand and we'll just you can unmute yourself, or you can put a question in the chat. Erica, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Erica. How you doing?
Good. Mike and I are both in the Diocese of Connecticut, so we're buddies. Um, my question, and you may not have any idea, but as you know, I'm a special needs mom, and our usual resources for getting assistance and help aren't active right now. It's usually through the
Okay.
schools or through the state. The state, the DDS department, the phone just will not be answered, and schools
Yeah.
are obviously doing what they can do, but it's not a lot. I've tried the 211 number and
Hmm.
that hasn't been super effective. They're very nice, but they're just like, wow, this is a whole different thing than what we usually try to help with. Do you know of anyone that's doing anything right now local, or is this a need that I sure hope I don't have to start?
Well, I don't want to give you any more work to do, so I would say it maybe not a need to start, but it is definitely an issue that I can raise with some of the groups I'm part of. I haven't heard anything, but the food issue has kind of dominated a lot of the conversations. So I'll tell you what, let me take this to a couple of the working groups that I'm on and see if we can find some kind of back channel way to get a resource out of the system. And I know United Way right now, I mean, a typical turnaround time to get a call back is like 5 minutes. It's like 24 hours right now. So they are just absolutely swamped. But let me do some checking on that and I will let you know.
Okay, I'm the administrator for a couple special needs families groups, so I could
Okay,
distribute anything that comes along. Thanks.
perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. We do have a question in the chat for financial donations. I heard there
Mhm.
was a state group they said was better to donate to them and they distribute it to other organizations, which is better.
I'm not familiar with such a state group, and I know all of the members of Connecticut Villette are all nonprofits, so they all receive donations directly. Um, I know United Way and a few others will do grants to other organizations, but I have not heard of any single state group that is providing funds out to others through this. So if you've got a name, I'm kind of curious, but I would probably go. The other thing to keep in mind is if there is a single state group that is doling out funds like that, they're also using some of those funds to cover administrative cost, which is reducing the amount that's actually getting to the organization. So far better just to go direct to the organization. If you're gonna, if you want to donate to Red Cross or Salvation Army or wherever, just go direct with them. Because especially the larger organizations have really good mechanisms already in place to receive donations, and the smaller ones, anymore they do too because of PayPal and things like that. They're very capable of taking donations. But I would go direct to the source especially if you're going to make a financial contribution.
Okay, other questions? Christine, do you want to go ahead?
Actually, I just want to say kudos. Mike, I've taken the Interfaith Leadership in Crisis. I'm so out of my league. I'm so out of my league because this interests me, and I want to get involved. I have no idea how to do that. I am not in charge of anything. I am just a member of discernment in my church, but you're lining right up. I mean, your chart's right with Dr. Mosher. I just read that. Brett, did you read that? Just read that this morning. That chart is like spot on with the honeymoon phase and the whole phase. And so I'm very excited. I do have one question. You mentioned the COVID guidance and how to be a safe volunteer.
Mhm.
Is that something that you've done? Is that some sort of sheet or something you could? My sister's in charge of volunteers. She works for New Jersey Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and so she's
Yeah.
in charge of a whole bunch, like 400 volunteers herself. And I've never heard her. I think they're trying to do this down there in New Jersey. The Rutgers University is trying to get together and organize their kind of volunteers, and I don't know if that is some sort of something you can share, or is that proprietary? Or
Yeah, so there are several out there, and I was just trying to take a quick look on. So if you go to on the National VOAD website, and I'm just trying to bring this up really quick to see if it is there. There are some sample guidance documents that have been developed by different organizations. I think Habitat for Humanity may have developed one. Team Rubicon may have one. So there are some samples out there. The ones I did for Meals on Wheels drivers, that one, I literally just sat down really quick. And there's two things I would put in that guidance. First is evaluate what your volunteers are doing that may not be safe. So a Meals on Wheels driver has to hand somebody food. All right, well, how can you change that to make it safe in this environment? Of course, there's things like, wear a mask, wear gloves, have hand sanitizer and all that. And then back that up with and adhere to CDC guidance, WHO guidance, whatever you have. So if you're going to start from scratch, I mean, first off, look for some resources. National VOAD website's got plenty, but just do a quick thumbnail sketch. What do your volunteers normally do that might be a little risky in this environment, and how can you adapt that? And sometimes it's tricky because, like, on Meals on Wheels, there are federal regulations that require the meal to be delivered in a certain way. So we had to adapt around that as well.
Cool, appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking maybe we want to bring Brett in here for a few minutes just to add to whatever the conversation, and maybe both Brett and Mike could tell people which program they're in at Hartford Seminary.
Yeah, so I'm in the MA in Transformative Leadership and Spirituality, just going into my last year of that program.
And I just completed the program that Mike just mentioned, and I guess I would just say, well, first of all, Mike, thank you for doing this great presentation. One of the things that came up, and I put this in the group chat, when I was in the military, I was stationed in Japan when H1N1 showed up, which the World Health Organization officially classified as a pandemic. However, it was nowhere near the scale of COVID-19. And one of the biggest things that came up for government to government relations between Japan and the United States, and working with a lot of these nonprofit organizations overseas, there was the International Red Cross and a lot of very large nonprofits. And one of the amazing things that came up was that a lot of people were trying to just put information out there for public consumption via every available method possible. And unfortunately, a lot of the information was not true. It was not based in science. It was, people trying to do the right thing. However, their information wasn't vetted by the right experts, unfortunately, and it caused the public to believe some things that weren't true. And so I guess the other thing that I would just, want everyone to be aware of is, the internet has grown exponentially since 2009 and 2010, and it's gotten to the point now where really it's just this 24/7 stream of information, and it just never ends. And I think people were already, in a way, kind of suffering from fatigue from internet exposure just due to COVID-19, and I think the longer this goes on, one of the are not 20-day, 7-day-a-week stress like what we've all been experiencing as part of COVID. And now, unfortunately, due to some recent events, the stress levels are even higher. And so one of the things that Mike and I talked about was we all have coping mechanisms, and some of those may have been very effective, pre-COVID, but now they might actually be insufficient. And so I think a lot of people now are trying to find new coping mechanisms to handle this continuous stress of, having this medical crisis. And now, unfortunately, we also have this spiritual crisis, which has taken on a new form. So that's one of the things that I would just want people to be aware of is, as individuals, whether you're leading a group or providing caregiving for someone else, I think we're all doing that for each other in new ways now. And, I use the vision of the overflowing cup, which is something that I refer to frequently, because you have to make sure you're doing things for yourself on a daily basis to keep your cup full so that you have overflow to pour into other people's spiritual cups. I think that's even more important now than it was, when we were only concerned about one crisis, and now we're worried about two. Plus, Mike, you mentioned hurricane season. And also I would say, make sure you're giving yourself time every day just for you, as an individual, as a person, because if you're just constantly communicating with others, even the most extroverted people need some time for, just some self-reflection and to honestly recharge your spiritual batteries. So that's what I would offer to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. That's very helpful. I'm going to let Mike have another minute or two to answer just a couple of these other questions, but I just want to say before people need to leave the call, we are recording this session. I will get the PowerPoint from Mike, and we will package all of that up and send it out to you in an email as a follow-up. Also, it will be sent to the people who registered who couldn't log on today. So in that email, you'll see there will be a donation link as well. These webinars are free, and we are eager to do more of them. So if it's in, if you can possibly donate and you'd like to support more of these, please do. And we'll send all that as a follow-up. But Mike, I'm going to let you end. And if you want to answer any of the other questions, I see one that says, are there any specific ways that we can support clergy in particular who are dealing with so many of these issues?
Yeah, so I see that, and I see one other question I want to address as well. So the first one is the earlier question about teens volunteering during this time. That's been a bit of a tricky thing because usually each organization has its own age restrictions on volunteers, so that still kind of applies, but it might actually be tightened down just a little bit right now. So that's when you have to address with each volunteer based organization. That one you'd have to kind of you'd have to look at each opportunity and look at its requirements there. The second one is on clergy support during this time, and I was trying to find it, and I will find the link to this. There's a great organization, New York Disaster Interfaith Network, that does a tremendous training, particularly on this area, and they've got a whole wealth of resources. They're also part of the National Interfaith Disaster Network, NIDN, for some reason his name just escaped me. Peter Goditis, the chair of that organization, just has just a wealth of information, and I know they just did a training session on clergy support during COVID. So if you do a quick Google search for National Disaster Interfaith Network or New York Disaster Interfaith, it should come up, and I will try to find the exact link to that as well. I know they've partnered with Disaster Chaplains Association on that as well. Thank you, Brett. Brett's got it. So the one thing I would say is if you've got any specific questions, I will put I will put my email address in the chat. So if you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me. I'm happy to help, and we'll get some additional resources that can go out with the presentation and all of that. And I had one other thing, but I can't remember what it is now. So I will end there, I guess.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, for sharing your time with us. And if you have any ideas for future webinars that we should be doing, please send them to me. I'll also put my email in the chat. And thank you again. Have a very good day.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.